three great figures, there are others, but these are considered the seminal figures, begin to raise questions which complicate the whole issue of consciousness. Their argument is it's not just that consciousness doesn't clearly understand what it's looking at. It's also, and is therefore alienated from it, it's also that consciousness is alienated from its own underpinnings, that it doesn't have any clear sense of where it's coming from any more than what it's looking at. In other words, that consciousness is not only estranged from the world, but that it is in and of itself inauthentic. Marx is, in the famous argument about commodity fetishism in Capital, is comparing the way in which we take the product of human labor and turn it into a commodity by saying that it has objective value, by saying that we know what its value is in and of itself. He compares that with religion. The argument is, well, God is a product of human labor. In other words, it's not a completely supercilious argument. Sort of God is brought into being the same way objects that we make use of are brought into being. God is a product of human labor. But then we turn around and we say God exists and has value objectively. Marx's argument is that the two forms of belief in the objective value of the commodity and belief in God are the same. Now, whether or not any of this is true, believe me, is neither here nor there. The point that Marx is making is that consciousness, that is to say, the way in which we believe things, is determined by factors outside its control. That is to say, in the case of Marx's arguments, social, historical, and economic factors that determine what we think and which in general we call ideology. That is to say, ideology is driven by factors beyond the ken of the person who thinks ideologically. So you see, the problem for consciousness now is not just a single problem, it's twofold. It's inauthentic relationship with the things it looks at, and also its inauthentic relationship with its own underpinnings. The argument is exactly the same for Nietzsche, only he shifts the ground of attack. For Nietzsche, the underpinnings of consciousness, which make the operations of consciousness inauthentic, are the nature of language itself. That is to say, that when we think we're telling the truth, we're actually using worn-out figures of speech. What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which became poetically and rhetorically intensified, etc., 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 and now no longer and are now no longer of account as coins, but are debased. Now that word "now" is very important. It suggests that Nietzsche does somehow believe that there's a privileged moment in the history of language when perhaps language is a truth serum, when it is capable of telling the truth. But language has now simply become a question of worn-out figures, all of which dictates what we believe to be true. I speak I speak in a figurative way about the relationship between the earth and the sky, and I believe that there's a sky god. I speak because I simply don't believe that I'm using figures of speech. All of this is implied in Nietzsche's argument. In other words, language, the nature of language, the way language is received by us, in turn determines what we can do with it, which is to say, determines what we think. So that for Nietzsche, the distortion of truth, that is to say, the distortion of the power to observe in consciousness, has as its underlying cause language. The state of language, the status of language. Freud finally argues for exactly the same relationship between consciousness, that is to say, what I think I am thinking from minute to minute, and the unconscious, which perpetually, in one way or another, unsettles what I'm thinking and saying from minute to minute. You know that in the psychopathology of everyday life, Freud reminded us that the Freudian slip isn't something that happens just sometimes, and nobody knows this better than a lecturer. It's something that happens all the time. And the Freudian slip is something that one lives with simply as a phenomenon of the slippage of consciousness under the influence of the unconscious. Now, Freud says a very interesting thing, which is that after all, we have absolutely no objective evidence that the unconscious exists. You know, I mean, the unconscious, if I could see the unconscious, it'd be conscious, right? The unconscious, what Freud is saying, is something that we have to infer from the way consciousness operates. We've got to infer something. We've got to figure out somehow how it is that consciousness is never completely inhibited, never completely does and says what it wants to say. So the spin on consciousness for Freud is the unconscious. Now, someone who didn't fully believe Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, a very important modern philosopher in the hermeneutic tradition, named Paul Ricoeur, famously said that these great precursors of modern thought, and particularly, I would immediately add, of modern literary theory, together dominate a school of suspicion. There is, in other words, in Ricoeur's view, a hermeneutics of suspicion. And skepticism or suspicion is a word that can also be appropriated, perhaps more rigorously for philosophy, as negativity. That is to say, whatever seems manifest or obvious or patent in what we're looking at is undermined for this kind of mind by a negation, which is counterintuitive. That is to say, which would seem not just to qualify what we understand ourselves to be looking at, but to undermine it altogether. One thing Ricoeur leaves out, and something that we can anticipate as becoming more and more important for literary theory and other kinds of theory in the 20th century, is Darwin. That is to say, it strikes me that Darwin could very easily be considered a fourth hermeneut of suspicion. Of course, Darwin was not interested in suspicion, but he was certainly the founder of ways of thinking about consciousness that are determined, sociobiologically determined in the realm of cognitive science, determined as artificial intelligence, and so on. All of this is Darwinian thinking, and I think increasingly will be central in importance in the 21st century. What will alter the shape of literary theory as it was known and studied in the 20th century is, I think, an increasing emphasis on cognitive science and sociobiological approaches, both to literature and to interpretive processes that will derive from Darwin in the same way that strands of thinking of the 20th century derive from the three figures that I've mentioned. Last time we introduced the way in which the preoccupation with literary and other forms of theory in the 20th century is shadowed by a certain skepticism. But as we were talking about that, we actually introduced another issue which isn't quite the same as the issue of skepticism, namely determinism. In other words, we said that in intellectual history, first you get this movement of concern about the distance between the perceiver and the perceived, a concern that gives rise to skepticism about whether we can know things as they really are. But then, as a kind of aftermath of that movement, in figures like Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, and you'll notice that Foucault reverts to such figures when he turns to the whole question of founders of discursivity. In figures like that, you get the further question, not just how we can know things in themselves as they really are, but how we can trust the autonomy of that which knows. In other words, how we can trust the autonomy of consciousness if, in fact, there's a chance, a good chance, according to these writers, that it is in turn governed by, controlled by hidden powers or forces. And this question of determinism is as important in the discourse of literary theory as the question of skepticism. They're plainly interrelated in a variety of ways, but it's more that question to which I want to return today. Now, last time, following Ricoeur, I mentioned Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud as key figures in this sort of secondary development that somehow inaugurates theory. And then I added Darwin. And it seems particularly important to think of Darwin when we begin to think about the ways in which, in the 20th century, a variety of thinkers are concerned about human agency. That is to say, what becomes of the idea that we have autonomy, that we can act, or at least that we can act with a sense of integrity and not just with a sense that we're being pulled by our strings like a puppet. In the aftermath of Darwin in particular, our understanding of natural selection, our understanding of genetic hardwiring, and other factors makes us begin to wonder in what sense we can consider ourselves, each of us, to be autonomous subjects.